All right, you're listening to the Maker's Quest podcast. I'm Brian Benham.
And I am Greg Porter. And today we are talking about gathering inspiration for your designs. And I think all of us probably have a little bit of a voice in the back of our head that says, don't steal somebody else's work. But by the same token, you have to somehow gather inspiration for what you're about to do, and with the hopes that maybe you change it enough, you personalize it enough that it becomes yours. The question I would have for you, Brian, to kick this off is what's the first step that you take when you're starting a new project and gathering inspiration? What is it that you do to start that process?
Well, it kind of all depends on the client and the project. There's a lot of different things that go into creating a design. And one thing I think a lot of people worry about is what you mentioned, ripping people off. And I think that is something that if you are deliberate in your intention on trying to iterate on someone else's design, that it's not really ripping off, it's more inspired by. To kind of tell you a story of how I look at this. um when I was a kid, I grew up in Eugene, Oregon, and my main focus was to be a music teacher. And then that way I'd have my health insurance and 401k all covered. And then I'd be able to spend the summer playing my saxophone, travel in the United States, uh, you know, being a gig working musician during the summer and still have health insurance and all that. So to facilitate that, I took lessons from a local saxophone player. You may have heard of his band that he helped found, the Cherry Poppin' Daddies.
Oh yeah.
They were a ska band. They had a top 40s song. I think it was called Zoot Suit Riot.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that was in the late 90s, somewhere around there. But one thing that he taught me was to keep a list of musicians you want to jam with. Because when you're in a jazz situation, you're jamming with other guys, there'd be kind of like a call, it'd be kind of like a call and response
Yep.
situation where you'd play off of each other's licks. So one guy would play a little something, and then you would build on top of what he played off of. And so you would start to be able to use what they played to build your own style of improv, or they might use what you played to build their own style of improv. So it's kind of like the sharing of ideas, playing back and forth, playing off of each other's licks, and you just kind of develop your own style from that process. So he kept a list about all the musicians that he respected and thought were doing really amazing work. And whenever he could figure out a way to set himself or be in a position where he could be like, "Hey, I would love to jam with you," he would help take that opportunity to do that. So I think as furniture designers, I've tried to do some of that myself, and set my life up to be able to meet other people and other designers and other furniture makers that I respect. So, like, if we take Daryl Peart, for example, he is a really great green and green inspired builder. He builds a lot of green and green furniture, and I love the green and green style, but I always kind of wanted to make it my own. But setting up my life to be able to interact with him. So basically, through the Wood Whisperer Guild, he teaches a course on green and green furniture there, and so I was able to work with him to draw the plans. So that really kind of helped me develop my own green and green style.
That's fascinating in terms of making that connection both on the music side of things, but then on the furniture side of things. I mean, one of my good buddies, Tom Mills, he has a YouTube channel called Green Shorts, and he has, I think, Green Short. He has several channels, but he has Green Shorts and then Green Shorts DIY. And on the DIY channel, he referred to one of the projects that he did as jazz carpentry, and I had never heard those 2 words put together before, but it was looking at, number 1, the materials that he had to work with, which were all salvaged, materials, repurposed materials, and understanding that not everything had to match perfectly, that it could be a little bit more loose, and it could be, something that was more inspirational than it was professional. And by the same token, taking cues from other projects and other buildings, other things of that nature, so that you did put together this very improvisational carpentry, which is a really weird way, in the carpentry world, we think of things in measured plans and very accurate things that fit really well. And he kind of turned that idea on its head for me. But from, again, we're talking about gathering inspiration from being able to take little things from here and little things from there, and by the time you mix them all together, it's something completely different. And it's interesting, Brian, that you mentioned the jazz piece. I had in my notes, for everybody out there, we do make some notes before we record these things, just things that you want to make sure that you mention. One of my notes is I talk to our architectural staff all the time about architecture being just like blues music, and that same thing. You sit around with a bunch of guitar players and somebody plays a little bit of a lick, right? There might be some rhythm to it, or there might be a melody line to it. And then the next person takes that lick and adds a little bit to it. And by the time that song gets back around the circle, it still has some of the DNA that it started with, but it's definitely an offspring, and it's something completely different and completely new. And the cool thing is it's usually something better than where it started, because everybody's added a little bit of their own flavor. And now all of a sudden this jam has some legs to it. It has some width to it. It has places for different people to improvise within it. And there's a lot of power, back to what we started talking about there. There's a lot of power in building on ideas rather than saying, I have to come up with something so fresh and innovative that nobody's seen anything like it ever before. I think there's a lot more power in saying, well, let's take layer 1, then add layer 2, add layer 3, add layer 4. That makes a very, very interesting and complex final result.
And I find it interesting that you also use the music analogy for people listening. How we record this podcast, we generally come up with the topic the day we record, and then we take a few minutes to write our notes about what we're going to talk about, but we never share our notes with each other.
Yeah.
So sometimes I will have a couple of notes of points that I want to hit on, but the conversation will go off in another direction. So I think it's also important when you're designing things, if someone pitches you an idea and it doesn't fit with your idea, that you can't be married to that idea and try to force it into the build if their idea is better. So same kind of thing of how we record the podcast. We want it to kind of grow organically and not just be trying to constantly force our individual ideas in there. So that way the podcast kind of goes off on its own and kind of becomes its own thing. And that's kind of the great thing about design when you're working with other people, is that it just kind of goes off on its own thing, that it may not have started out where you thought it was going to go.
I think I would wholeheartedly agree, Brian. And I know I've mentioned one of my biggest influences in my design career was Dan Rockhill, that professor back at KU. I took a furniture building class with Dan, and at the start of the class, everybody starts off with a blank page, right? When you're young and you're in design school, you get a little bit of that empty page syndrome, right? And I came into him with, some sketches of some crazy things that I thought I was going to build. And Dan, sort of grabbed me by the shoulders and said, this is too much. You're never going to get done. You're biting off more than you could chew. And of course I was like, oh no, it was, I remember one of my designs was this kind of weird sinuous shape with a shock absorber on the back of it. And it was, going to have all these moving parts and everything else. And he's like, you don't have any idea what this is going to actually take you to complete. And you only have a couple months, and you have other class, coursework stuff to attend to. And so he just grabbed a magazine off the shelf. It was a Metropolis magazine. I can still remember because it's really large. It was like a tabloid format magazine. It was really unique. And he goes, I want you to flip through here and find a really nice looking piece of furniture, something that's, really well done, refined. And, so we flipped through, and I was like, oh, this one's pretty cool. And he goes, build that exact piece of furniture. And I was like, well, this is design school. I don't just want to copy somebody's project. And he said, I guarantee when you get done building this piece of furniture, it will not be a copy of this thing. You're going to try, but you're not even going to get close, but you're going to change things as you start to build this. and it's going to become something that's yours. And of course, this was a class that was about welding and doing woodwork and doing some of the other things that I still do to this day. And he understood the technical challenges that I was going to face that I had no idea were ahead of me. I thought, I was a big shot. I already knew how to weld. I already knew how to do this stuff, but I couldn't do it in a refined manner. But it was a really interesting thing that if you, and I think this is good for our listeners, there are some people who are listening who may never design something from scratch in their entire woodworking or metalworking careers. They will build things off of patterns and off of plans that other people have made. But the reality is, even in using those patterns or those prints, there are opportunities for you to affect the design in small ways. I'll say, for instance, the choice of fastener, how the fasteners are either above or countersunk or below the surface of the work. Those details completely change the way that a piece finishes out and what it looks like and how refined it is. And just that one small choice of fastener can take a project from being someone else's to being yours. And I think a lot of people out there don't understand that the power in those small details, and that you can start a design project by copying somebody else's idea.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. To go back to that magazine idea where he gave you the magazine and told you won't be able to build that exact piece the way it is. In the woodworking world, we kind of all follow each other. So I'll see something that someone built and I'll know that they tried to copy another builder because I know whose piece that is. But you look at it and it's not the same piece for various reasons. When they're trying to copy it off a picture, they don't know how severe that curve is in real life. They're just approximating it. They don't know exactly how big it is other than just the overall size. So all those little things start to morph this thing and change the proportions into something that's slightly different. And if they're a little more deliberate about those changes and experimented, okay, with that curve a little bit more, should I curve it more? Should I curve it less? Is that going to make it my own design? So yeah, all those things totally affect the end result. And then grain direction is
Yeah.
huge. There's so many times where I've designed something and I do sell plans to that thing. And I spent a ton of time looking and analyzing the grain and finding a grain that curves with the curve of the piece, a figured piece of grain for an accent panel. And then when I'm done, I'm thinking, yeah, this looks really good. And then someone will send me a picture of the plans that they bought and they built it and they paid no attention to any of that. And it looks like a terrible design just because they didn't make any kind of decisions on grain in their design.
Well, I think the old saying, um, I hear a lot, the devil's in the details, and I always say it differently. I say God is in the details, because the devil's in the details insinuates that the details can cause problems. And I would like to insinuate that the details can take something from ordinary to extraordinary. And it's all the small things. And the one that I point out all the time, if you've ever experienced an Eames lounge chair, the real McCoy, I think Steelcase has the license to make those, if I'm not mistaken. If you ever sit in one of those and run your hands over it and under take in the craftsmanship of an Eames lounge, and then sit in a knockoff, it is a completely different experience. The depth of the tufting for the upholstery, the edges of the bent wood, there's a rubber, I think there's a rubber interface between the bent wood and the leg frame, and there's a flex to that rubber that is very particular, and if you get it wrong, it ruins the chair. and and some of them don't even have that rubber interface. They're just a fastener that bolts through. And it's all a completely different interface. And you could argue, is one better than the other? Sure, one's better or one's more desirable, but the bottom line is they're different. And that same level of difference can can advance it maybe even another step further. If you wanted to, again, do a design project and you said, well, I'm going to start off with an Eames lounge, and I'm going to take it and I'm going to redo how the bottom pan attaches to the back. I don't know what you call the back. I guess it might be called a pan as well, but I don't think it is. I think we seat pan and back shell maybe, and change how it attaches. And it may not be the angle, it may not be anything about the profile, it just may be physically how one thing attaches to another. You could potentially improve that Eames design. There, purists will say that you can't, but there are opportunities to do that. Or if there's pattern that you can put in the bent wood, or if there's a different way that the upholstery wraps around instead of stop short, or there's an edge detail that you could put on it that would be different, that maybe doesn't show the plies. Maybe it covers it up and dresses it up just a little bit with a different species of wood that's contrasting. I think those are the types of things when I look at, I'll go back, and another influential teacher that I had, Daniel Rodriguez, he was a Harvard grad. Um, he told me early on, I think it was my first year of design school, he said, don't borrow an idea from somebody, steal it. And, when you first hear that, you're like, well, what the hell's the difference? He said, well, if you borrow it, you're just sort of keeping it the same. If you steal it, you're going to change it enough that people can't identify it anymore. So, and it's like, yeah. And he's like, and make it yours, put your identity on somebody else's idea. And all of a sudden it's something new. And it's a unique way to look at it. But I think in the design world, there are very few totally unique ideas anymore, right? Everything is an iteration, like you mentioned earlier. It's an iteration. You hope that it's an improvement, but it's a change. Maybe it's in function, maybe it's in the aesthetics. That'll get. The hope is that you advance whatever it is that you're doing to the next layer of beauty, complexity, elegance, however you want to say it.
Yeah, the design is not something that you can do in a vacuum. There has to be some kind of input. Just like you said, the blank slate or blank page syndrome, that you're sitting at the blank page. What do I do? If you have no direction, you have no idea.
I mean, when we're talking about gathering inspiration, right? There's the, hey, I want to build one of these and maybe I want to make this my own. But the impetus for whatever it is that you're doing, maybe it is something new. Hey, I've got a chair or a table that I need to perform in a different way than what I've seen before. I need to build a coffee table that can rotate so that whoever's using it can set something on it and move it to the next person. I don't know what it is. And so there may not be something out there that's the exact basis of what you're trying to do. Then I think when I'm looking at gathering inspiration, I think there's a few different categories that I gather it from. One is the function side of things. How would somebody make a rotating top on a table? And I think we've all seen the cool videos where the guy rotates the tabletop and it gets bigger, right? And then
Yeah.
it shrinks in. And then there's other ones that maybe it's a lazy Susan with a hole in the middle, and when you turn it, something else happens. Or maybe it's just very simply somebody used a certain kind of dowel as a roller, and the way that interfaced between the bottom and the rotating part was unique, and you can borrow that detail, but the form of the thing is very different. So that's the function side of things. But then on the aesthetic side of things, I think that's where the world completely opens up, to me anyway. When I'm putting together, we have inspiration boards at the office. I usually keep a couple, how would I say it, in progress inspiration boards at all times. I swap things out, and the things that are on there are not related to architecture and buildings that I'm designing. They might be automotive. They might be my motorcycles that I think are cool. It might be furniture. It might be products that I think are cool, because aesthetically, either there's a color, there's a contrast, there's a texture, there's a pattern to something that I find interesting. And, I've gotten hung up several times in my life on houndstooth patterns. There's like a billion different houndstooth patterns out there, and they're all really inspiring, and how you can look at the person who set up a loom and made that pattern, you know, is it a interlaced pattern? Is it very particular? Is it big? Is it small? Whatever it is. And then how can I apply that aesthetic inspiration? Maybe it's the red paint on a Ducati motorcycle and how that interfaces with a satin chrome that's on the frame, or that's on um, the piston, or the cylinders on the engine. And those types of aesthetic contrast can inspire a myriad of things. You could be looking at a motorcycle, but designing the lobby of a hotel, and some of those interactions between shiny and dull, or colorful and, you know, saturated and unsaturated, light and dark, uh, cold and warm, you know, all of those types of things can, as we gather those things, I think it's important for us as makers to understand that a car can influence a house, that a piece of furniture can inspire flatware. And don't sell yourself short in terms of, if I'm building a table, I just need to look at tables and how people have done it. And if I'm building something out of wood, I need to look at other things that have been made out of wood. I think sometimes if you're doing a carpentry project, you can look way outside of carpentry. I've seen somebody recently, and actually when I was in Boston at the Build Space was the first time I saw it. There was a Harvard Graduate School of Design student there working on a 5-axis CNC, making some furniture for an installation. And he was using this 5-axis CNC to carve logs, full logs. And he was putting a tufted upholstery pattern on them. So like the buttons down in the diamond pattern, right, that you see in coffins and things of that nature. He was using this 5-axis CNC to create that pattern on a piece of wood. So you're sitting on a log, but it looks like your grandma's 1920s divan. and it was a really unique inspiration for a log piece of furniture. Was, you know, something that is very padded and tufted and from the upholstery world.
Yeah, so to play off your uh inspiration boards where there's things on there that have nothing to do with architecture, I think that is a really good way to go about creating something truly unique. I'm working with a client now, and this is a project that won't be made public just because of the nature of what this project is. It's an earn for a client, and he asked me not to publish it on my YouTube channel or anything like that, just because it's a personal thing. But in designing this urn for this gentleman, he told me stories about how when he was a kid with his father, they walked on the beach, and there's some special moments on this beach, and so we tried to incorporate things into this project from the beach. And the thing, like if you look at beach sand, it's kind of has kind of a warm brown gray to it, or at least the beach sand that I've been exposed to. I know there's different types of sand around the world, but in general on the west coast, the beach sand has kind of a warm gray to it, but there's all kinds of little flecks of broken seashells and things in it. So one of the woods we selected is a wormy maple, or ambrosia maple, because the
Yeah.
ambrosia maple is kind of that same beach sand color. And then from the worms and things that have eaten into the wood to create those colors, that kind of looks like that the debris in the sand, those broken shells in the sand. And so just by having this conversation with my client about this special moment that they shared, I was able to construct a whole design based on that story. So the story kind of dictated the design, and things that were pulled in for inspiration had nothing to do with woodworking or furniture. It just had everything to do with telling the story.
I I always go back, and what you just shared reminded me of this, Brian. The old Reese's peanut butter cups advertisements from the 80s. You put your peanut butter in my chocolate. No, you put your chocolate in my peanut butter, or whatever it was. And it was that the whole commercial series was about somebody tripping and dropping their chocolate into peanut butter and creating this new thing that was a peanut butter cup. And oh wow, we have this unique taste because this accident happened. And I think there are so many things in the design world that can be those accidental, like, holy cow, how did we wind up here? And it's our job as designers to be that alchemist, right? Trying to put things together to get a result out that nobody expected to get. And I'll share this story. I don't think I've ever shared it on the podcast, but um, the guy who did 2 eye surgeries for me went to school with one of the guys who invented LASIK surgery. And he invented LASIK surgery because he was doing his residency in Boston, and somebody from the MIT laser lab called and said, I just pointed a laser at my eye and burned my eye. And he said, okay, bring him into the ER. And they brought him into the ER, and he was examining this guy's eyeball and like, tell me about these lasers. What are you doing with them? He's like, well, we can melt certain things with them and we can do other things. And he's like, this is interesting. And as he's looking at this guy's eyeball, he's like, how well can you control these lasers? It's like, oh, we can, control them down to whatever amount of detail. And all of a sudden he's like, well, I wonder if I could reshape people's corneas with these things. And those 2 guys invented LASIK surgery as we know it today.
Oh,
And it
wow.
was, this chocolate in peanut butter situation where you had some guy who was technical and understood a lot about lasers, but nothing about eyeballs. And you had another guy that knew everything about eyeballs and nothing about lasers. And all of a sudden they have an accidental meeting, so to speak. And all, it changes the way that we view nearsightedness and our ability to actually correct something that was uncorrectable before. I say that because I think the same is true in other forms of design. So that's product design, right? They designed a product that fixes eyeballs. That's pretty cool. Um, but when you get outside of your comfort zone and you start playing with things, whatever they are, if it's, I'm not a plumber, I don't know much about plumbing, but every once in a while I go into the plumbing aisle at Home Depot and I just start pulling stuff off the shelf and putting it together in the aisle. Like, what does this do? How can I do this? Will this connect to that? Yeah. Okay, cool. And all of a sudden you walk away with some inspiring idea about how maybe a plumbing or pipe threading machine might help you do the next thing, right? There's always that knee jerk. Everybody uses the pipe flange and rigid pipe to make legs on tables and things like that, which we've all seen that done. But there's there's thousands of other things you can do from a design perspective with some of those fittings and some of those ideas. And maybe you want to thread something that's not plumbing pipe, but it's something else that you're doing. Those types of, I'll call it the chocolate and peanut butter things that maybe you're not exposed to normally. If you expose yourself to those things, I think that's a wonderful way of gathering inspiration.
One of my favorite designs I've done was because I cut a leg too short. I made this oval table and it has 3 tiers to it, and it has 4 legs, one on each endpoint of the oval. And I cut 3 of the legs, and for some reason my brain spaced off and I went off to work on something else. And during that time, I moved the stop on the table saw to make a different cut. So now it's shorter than what it was, and I realized I didn't cut that 4th leg, and so I was like, "Oh, I just need to cut that 4th leg," and so I threw it on the table saw, forgetting that I had moved the stop from earlier, and I made that cut to cut that leg to length, and now it's too short. And I was like, I don't know what I'm gonna do now. I'm like, I'm gonna have to go to the store and buy some more wood. But then as I was sitting there playing around with the design, like, you know what, it's gonna look pretty damn cool with one leg that's shorter than the other that hits that lower shelf of the table. So it's like holding up the lower shelf of the table, and then the top is cantilevering with 3 legs.
Bob Ross would call that a happy accident.
Happy accident, yeah. Bob Ross, that guy,
Uh,
he knew what he was doing.
he did, and I think there's definitely a lot of value in understanding that we all make mistakes. We all do things that we didn't intend to do. but all of those mistakes are an opportunity, either number one, to learn a lesson and get better at what you're doing, or number two, it's an opportunity to design around whatever just happened. And, I'm sure you've been stuck before where you had three things that all had grain that kind of looked similar, but then a fourth one that didn't. Well, okay, maybe that's the contrast in the piece. Maybe that's
Mhm.
the one different thing that I can make stand out or feature in some way or somehow connect in a different manner that makes it make sense, that enhances the piece rather than detracts from the piece. I think that's a whole skill set that when you hang around people that are in their 70s that are still doing design work and building things, they are very good at those, at featuring things that other people would see as a problem, and they figure out a really unique way. And it's simply because of the number of reps that they've put in over the years and how that sparked all their creativity. Do I throw this in the trash because I've got this one thing that isn't working right, or do I outsmart it and make it a reason to make this thing just a little bit cooler than it is right now? And I think that's a huge design talent when you can put a constraint aside. You can turn a constraint into a positive force in the design.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was trying to rack my brain of a good example of that, but that's happened to me so many times that I think it's just now like it's just like an everyday thing. So I don't really I can't really think of a good example, but it's just it's nonstop, constant, like nothing ever works the way you want it to work. If it does, it's an amazing thing that, oh, it worked the first time. But like there's so many things that just come out of like, oh, that didn't work out very well, but I don't want to throw it away because I have all this time invested in it. So I have to turn it into something else. And then it just kind of grows from there.
One of my buddies told me one time, it's amazing. The harder I work, the luckier I get. and it's a really good way to look at it. You see a lot of people and you're like, oh wow, they're really blessed with this talent or that talent. And in the design world, I have people that I look up to, to an immeasurable amount. Like, wow, this guy came out of the womb, or this lady came out of the womb, an incredible designer. And I've talked to a number of those people that I've idolized in my life. I've just been lucky enough to wind up in the same room as them, or to just pick up the phone and call them. It's amazing sometimes who answers the phone when you call somebody's office, or how quickly you can get to that person and set aside some time or make an appointment to talk to them about stuff. There's not a single person that I've ever talked to that I'll start off and think, man, this person was just born with amazing talent. And you get into the discussion and you realize that they've worked their ass off to get that level of talent. It's not free. It didn't come automatically. They worked for every bit of it. And when we talk about gathering inspiration, I think when you look at the result of a design, it is directly proportional to the amount of time and effort that's put into it. The first scribble that goes down on the page is not the end of the design process. That's the beginning of the design process. And I think a lot of people really believe that good designers take their first idea and their first idea is gold, and that whatever they put down on the page, that's good. That's going to be it. When Alvar Aalto drew his knee tables, I think is what they call them, the little Danish birch, beautiful bent wood tables, that's the first thing that came out of his hand. No, that came after 20 prototypes. It came after probably a year's worth of working on it to refine it and make it this beautiful, refined, minimalistic thing. And again, when we're talking about inspiration, sometimes inspiration comes over a long period of time. And sometimes that inspiration comes from the first iteration that you do, and you step back and you have to become your own critic, and you have to be a harsh critic. If you're not your own worst critic, you've got a problem. You're never going to get good at what you're doing. You have to be a harsh critic of your own work. Sometimes you have to seek out other people's advice too, because there are people who we get too close, we become myopic. But if you can, either through a drawing or through a prototype or whatever of your, the first iteration of your design, if you can step back and honestly look at it, criticize it, take your own criticism, bite your lower lip and say, okay, I'm going to do it again, but I'm going to do it better. And I'm going to change it. And I'm going to make this detail cooler, and then build that and step back again and say, how can I make this another step better? That's where you're going to wind up, I think, with those super refined, really well designed projects. Is it comes through hard work and iteration. And again, I'm saying it as you can gather inspiration from your first effort and your second effort and your third effort. And sometimes that's not necessarily, let's throw these prototypes away. Maybe those prototypes are good enough to sell, or they're good enough to make some money on, however that's happening, but you're learning and you're improving, and the next one you do is better. I know, Brian, I've heard you tell stories about making things, and then the next version of it you make is, that much better of it. And I think that's how we get really good at our craft.
Yeah, I think not rushing the process, not rushing the process, and really paying attention to what's happening during the process and paying attention to the end result and then stepping back and analyzing the end result. So to kind of give an example of that, this last winter I built a table I called the portal table. And if you go to my website and use the search box portal table, it should come up. But it has this segmented ring with this disc that looks like copper, but it's not actually copper. It is a piece of steel that I chemically treated to look like copper. And I had a vision in my head of what I wanted it to look like. And when the first time I applied the chemical, it didn't really look good at all. And so I sanded it and buffed it all off and started over again. I just kept paying attention to like how heavy I put the chemical down, what that would look like, and then what type of brush I would use. If I use like a sponge, like a sea sponge, and I dabbed it on there, it created a different texture versus using a paintbrush to paint it on there versus using a spray bottle to spray it on there. So each iteration, I just kept paying attention to what it looked like and like, okay, so next time I need to go a little heavier, and then I'm going to use a paper towel to dab it on there because I like the texture of that. And eventually, I got to a point to where I was like, okay, it's almost there. And I thought, okay, here's the point where I'm going to screw it up or I'm going to walk away from it. So I got some acid because there was a spot that I didn't really like. And so I touched the acid to it. And as soon as I touched the acid to it, I instant regret. Like, okay, that's not what I wanted. It totally looks terrible. But I knew that if I used this other chemical, it would kind of mix with the acid and turn the steel green just from past experience. And so then I put that on there, and then it just like looked better than what I envisioned. So just going through that whole process of just really paying attention and just taking note of what was happening throughout the process was allowed me to now, I'm pretty sure I can recreate that design again, just from my uh, attention to detail of paying attention to what was happening. My observation, I guess, is a better word to say that.
Yeah. And along those lines, Brian, I think one thing that another place we can gather inspiration, and as you were talking about that ring table, I can remember, seeing you've done several things that are segmented that have different pattern to them and different, and they're all different from one another, but they're all of the same family. Maybe they're cousins. I don't know how to say it, but I go back to uh, the things that I use when I'm struggling with something or when I'm critiquing my own work, and I go back to the Gestalt principles, which I think I've mentioned on this podcast before. I think there's 7 Gestalt principles, and it's line, point, and motion and contrast and scale and those types of things. But we can always go back to the fundamentals and go back to those design language type of teachings where you're looking at, one is a monolith, two is a pair, three is hierarchy. Those rules have saved my bacon so many times where I'm struggling with something. Why doesn't this look good? Why is this out of scale? Why does it look clunky? Whatever the issue is, and I go back to those things. What's the rhythm? What's the pattern? How does this break down? Is there, I always look at things, and you can look at things that aren't column related in regards to the Roman traditional columns. There's a base, there's a column, and there's a capital, and it breaks down in a certain scale. It doesn't have to be exact, but that's how things work. If you're looking at a table, there's a leg, there's an apron, there's a top, and those things need to have a certain proportion to look right. And if they're out of proportion, something is going to be wrong, and you have to identify those things. But you I always look at them like, if you're a basketball player, you have to learn to dribble, you have to learn to pass, and you have to learn to shoot. That's the three fundamental things. And if you can't do one of those things, you can't play basketball. and and in design, we have those too. And that is those Gestalt principles and some of those underlying very simple things, scale and proportion, are uh oh my gosh. Um, uh, the golden section. There we go. Ooh,
Yeah.
took a second, but the golden section. I always think of the conch, but the golden section. There's a reason why we've used that over and over again, because fundamentally those proportions are very nice. Does that mean you have to use them all the time? No, but there's probably a good relation back to those things in, looking at illustrations and renderings and drawings that we do. The 9 square grid, that is an unbeatable force. If you want your image to look good, you go back to that 9 square grid and you ask yourself, how is this breaking up? Where is the subject? How is it in relation to the horizon or the sky? And how is it uh, related to the foreground? There's another one: foreground, middle ground, background. That is such a simple thing to remember. And if your artwork has that, if your furniture piece has that, where does the eye rest? There has to be a foreground, there has to be a middle ground, and there has to be a background. There has to be somewhere for the eye to rest. There has to be somewhere for the eye to attract to. And anytime I'm looking for design inspiration, that's one of the common things I go back to, is those year one design school fundamentals.
Yeah, I'm looking up something because you sparked an idea in me when you're talking about the golden ratio. I'm looking some. I did a whole talk on this last year about how the golden ratio is BS, but we won't get into that in in this thing. And surprisingly, the talk went over pretty well. But I wanted to find a quote. Oh crap, I don't know how to pronounce his name. Massimo Viginelli. He was I believe, Italian designer, and he said, "Don't be governed by the grid, govern the grid." So that
Yes.
was kind of the thesis of my talk. That yes, the golden ratio looks awesome, but if you're trying to snap everything to each little piece of the golden ratio, it's not always ever going to fit, because you have all these things that you might need a drawer to be a certain function. But if you make all your drawers the golden ratio, they're going to have a drawer that's teeny tiny that's not going to be functionable. So I think that's just worth pointing out that as you go through life, that you need to, through your experiences, you need to kind of train your design eye that, okay, I'm going to use the golden ratio to start my design, but then I'm going to trust my design eye to be able to modify that to fit the function that I need, and it'll still look good.
There was I I share this with people all the time. There are two pieces to design: making the rules and breaking the rules. And we all have to make rules. We have constraints. It's a table. Well, it's got to be tall enough that I can pull a chair up to it. That's a rule. Okay, great. Can we break the rule? Yes. If I put bar stools around it, I need to make it taller. And so So there are always those things. And the golden ratio, I say that is a tool. And, if you go through and look at Palladian windows or some other Gothic arches, things like that, they don't fit that ratio. But if your design is inspired by something, it is very important to look at the proportions of what it is that you're trying to achieve. I mean, I go back to the onions on top of the Kremlin and some of those things, right? They don't fit any traditional design things, but there's something cool about them.
Yeah.
Um, uh, the Taj Mahal, very similar. I can't remember what you call that pattern in some of the Middle Eastern architecture, but it's not a traditional Roman proportion. But if you're going for that, there is definitely a subtleness and a beauty and elegance to those types of things. But again, we can make those rules, but then we can break those rules. And I think when you break the rules, that's when all the interesting stuff happens. That's the floating legs things that we see out there, that's completely different than a table that you've seen before, although it's rooted somewhere in something that you've seen, and maybe it takes your eye by surprise, and that's what makes it interesting. But I think absolutely making the rules and breaking the rules are two things that you have to do.
Yeah. So as you were talking, I made a couple of notes of a few things that I think important to touch on. You're talking about by segmented rings being in a cousin or a family, and I think that's a really good way to develop new products and new things using some of the same styles. So, like that segmented ring, I've modified it. I've made it an oval, and I put it around a speaker for a guitar amp.
Mhm.
You actually Thank you for
Like
playing
that.
it for me on my YouTube channel. If you guys want to listen to Greg play some guitar, you can search that up on my YouTube channel. And then I used it in a gaming shelf, made this huge big ring in a gaming shelf, and then I put it in a desk and now a table. And so I've used this same concept to generate new pieces as I've gone, and each piece was, well, with the exception of the portal table, I still own that. I haven't sold it yet. So if anybody wants to buy that, but each one of those pieces was designed specifically for a client, and I was able to use my past design to pitch to the client to fit their specific need. So I think that's a really good way to just pull in some inspiration to continue your journey in a specific style.
I think that you've brought up an interesting point, that as an artist, as a designer, um, you can have something that becomes your signature, and there's nothing at all wrong with reusing that signature over and over and modifying how that signature becomes part of your artwork. And there's I think is it Matt Groening, the guy who created The Simpsons, if I remember right? He puts his initials in the characters. Um, I think Homer's ear is an MG,
Oh,
and
interesting. I've
uh,
never paid any attention to that.
yeah. But there's all kinds of things that he hides in his characters, and it's his signature, and that's his actual signature. But you can have a design motif that carries from piece to piece, and you can have veins of design. So some designers have different phases or different I can't remember what I'm trying to think, but different phases that they go through where they design things in this vein and then this vein and that vein, and sometimes they come back and revisit those things. And doing those and expanding on those ideas, I think, is something that creates a body of work, a portfolio of work that becomes very interesting over time. And you can relate as somebody um, taking in that content, or if you're viewing it in a gallery situation where you can see that thread that goes through each piece. I think that makes for a very interesting design portfolio. And those motifs are really cool. The one that I would point out, if you ever walk into a Frank Lloyd Wright building, you can look for it. There will be a red tile in all of his buildings. And that was something that he started very early in his career, and even beyond his passing, the buildings that he built have a red tile, and that identifies it as a Frank Lloyd Wright. And it changed. Some of them are small, some of them are big, some of them are, I think, decorated. It's been a minute since I went down that rabbit hole and looked at all the different Frank Lloyd Wright tiles, but I've probably shared this before on the program. One of my former bosses, right out of school, Homer Williams, owned a Frank Lloyd Wright house. He owned the Bott House in Kansas City, which you can look up. Fascinating house, and it was built in, I think, 62, which was after Frank died. It was built by students from Taliesin, and that was one of the things. When you walked in the front door, you could look behind you and find the red tile. And it was just always such a cool thing. It's like, this makes it real. It's that Louis Vuitton tag, or I don't know what the big fashion is this at this point in time, but every purse maker or every fashion designer has their thing that they put in, their weird stitch. Some of them, I think, have a red stitch or something they'll put under the edge of a lapel, things of that nature. Anyway, I think those are really cool things to have in your work, and that starts to define an entire body of work instead of one piece.
Yeah, and some of those things may not necessarily be visible to anybody that's looking at the piece. Going back to the green and green style with Daryl Peart, when Daryl started using a CNC to help his production along, all these CNC bits came in this little plastic tube. So now when he builds a piece of furniture, he takes that plastic tube and he drills a hole behind the mortise. So you cut out the mortise, and then behind the mortise, he drills another hole the length of that plastic tube, and he'll write a note of something that's going on in the world and roll it up and stick it and embed that plastic tube inside the piece of furniture and then put the joint together. So there's this tube with something written in it in his furniture.
Well, that's fascinating. I had no idea. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's a cool idea. I think there's something interesting. Um, Again, if you're into fashion or whatever you're into, as the person who has the jacket on or the pair of shoes on, I think I've seen, I can't remember who it is. I think there's a shoemaker that puts like an inspirational saying on the tongue of the shoe. So when you put that shoe on, you can see that every time you put the shoe on. Make somebody smile today. I don't know what you would write on
Some
there.
kind of fortune cookie type of thing.
Yeah, very much so. But when you put those shoes on, you see it every time. No one else sees that but you. And there's something really cool about being that person. I could see, as a furniture designer, a building designer, if you're, I don't design offices anymore, but if you were designing somebody's office, putting something on the back side of the door that nobody else sees, because, hey, could you catch that door? Could you push that door closed when you leave, or whatever it is, where that person gets to see it every time, whether that's a pattern in the wood, or maybe it's again, some type of ornamentation that they get to see that nobody else does, that somehow has a meaning for them. I think that's a really cool thing. I'll go back to um, the door that I made for the Sutton house. So it's a house that I designed that sits on a lake, and I built the pivot door. It was a series I did of, like, felt like 1,000 videos on my YouTube channel, and Corten steel, and it was very sculptural, really fun door to design and build. But in that door, there's there's 5 pieces of glass, and it's one for every member of the family, and then one to look out of. So there's a sun, and that has a piece of glass, and then there's 4 other pieces of glass kind of randomly around the door, and they're all at different heights because there was a mom, a dad, and 2 little kids, one older than the other. And so they represent those 4 members of the family. They're the only ones who, well, now everybody listening to this podcast knows, but at one point in time, they were the only ones who knew that. And it was just our little thing. That's, the question was, well, why is there 5 pieces of glass? Well, there's a reason.
Yeah.
And
And that
I think those things are awesome.
Yeah, and that's like a snapshot in time, because that piece of glass that's down low as that child grew, right? So it captured a moment. It's like a picture of design of that family at that time. That's a really cool story
Which,
for sure.
interestingly enough, I think I built that door I think I finished that door in either 2011 or 2012. So it's been in place for a decade now. And I got to see that door last week. I went and visited, and it's Corten steel, and we left it outside for 3 or 4 months to rust before we installed it so that it wouldn't just bleed everywhere. And the last time I saw it, it was still really kind of orangey still, which is kind of the first phase of the rust. It sits
Mhm.
under an overhang, so it doesn't get massive exposure. But I saw it here last week, and it's finally gotten to that velvety purple almost color, like a really
Mm.
smooth bronze color, and it just looked
Yeah.
gorgeous. And I hadn't seen it in several years, and as I walk through it, I was like, oh man, this looks really good now. This is what I envisioned a decade ago when we were building it. So, really kind of cool to see that again.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to take into consideration in your designs. I had recently built a green and green style door, and uh, when I designed the door, um, I wanted it to be a little more contemporary, a little more modern than the original design, like in the Gamble house, where you have that design with the cloud lift and then the stained glass above it. I didn't want to get into stained glass because that's a whole another thing that would have been way more complicated for this particular project. But in place of the stained glass, I picked out some flame maple, so it has like all kinds of
Mm.
really crazy patterns in the grain of the wood, and that's in place of the stained glass. And the door is in the back of my shop. I installed it in my shop, and it faces a south facing wall, and it's totally exposed to the weather. There is zero protection. It's gotten the full front of the weather over the last 6 months, and I'm really excited of how well it's held up with the Colorado weather here. And
Mm-hmm.
then the coloring has really made that flame maple pop because it's inset inside cherry, which got really dark from the sun. And then below that are some walnut panels that have lightened up because of the sun. And so just the contrast and melding of all those colors, just like it looks way better than what I envisioned it when I designed it, just because of that I wanted that maple to represent the glass, but now you can just really tell that, yeah, that really does represent that glass. So just the patience of time has made that design worth it for sure.
I think that's, and we're probably a little bit off topic here, but when you're designing things, I think that's one thing that you have to be acutely aware of is what is this thing going to do over time. None of us have a crystal ball, right? We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but not being surprised, I think, is a big thing. And that informs your decision of how to make joints. That informs your decision of the type of fasteners to use, the type of adhesives to use, the type of materials to use. And, is this a wear surface? Is this an exposure surface? Is this the bottom side? What are we dealing with? And a lot of times when you go through some of that analysis, how is this going to look in 10 years? Where is it at? Who's walking by it? How many people are touching it? Are they setting things on it? If you've got all your drink bottles and they're going to go on there, that's going to inform that your finish has got to be a little bit different. You can't put an oil on there, or you'll be redoing the oil every month when there's a ring on there.
Hmm.
And maybe it's something that you're going to shoot a catalyzed clear on there, whether it's matte or glossy, and on and on. I think, uh, again, when you're looking for those small decisions in a project, they seem small but they make a big impact. Going through and analyzing what that piece may look like in 10 years is going to change the way you execute some of those things, either to make it stronger or to make it last longer, or if you want the effects of the weathering to change the piece over time, maybe you choose to not have a finish, and that's something completely different. And I think those design decisions are as important as the form.
Yeah, for sure. So I have one last thing on my notes. that I think's worth mentioning in designing things and finding inspiration is not to take the easy road
Mm-mm.
on things. I just did a this is kind of a dumb example because it's not very intricate, but I bid a restaurant to build some tables, and I bid the tops at an inch thick because one, I wanted to make sure I didn't scare them off with price because anything, the thicker you go, the more wood you the more you spend on wood, but also from a build ability standpoint, because it's a whole bunch of tables and I wanted to be able to crank them out really fast. And also easier to handle, easier to transport. Like the whole thing is just going to be easier if it's an inch thick. And then in the final meeting we had before closing the deal, the guy's like, I want the tabletops thicker. And I was like, damn it, but okay. And it looks way better. It just looks way better with that amount of mass on there.
Yeah, it's hard for us as human beings. None of us are looking to make our lives more complicated. They're already complicated enough. We have
Hmm.
enough stress. We we have enough outside factors making things uncomfortable for us. The last thing we want to do is add another level of discomfort. But I've always found that the best things come out of the most discomfort. Like
Hmm.
the worse the situation is, the better it's going to turn out. And you're absolutely right. Taking that step back and saying, this is the easy way. What's the hard way? Which way is going to come out better? You're 100% right, Brian.
Yeah, and I don't want to give specific examples just because I work as part of my business is to be a consultant for other people that want to do what I do and want to learn from me. And whenever I sitting in a consulting call and I pitch out an idea and they're like, oh, well, that's going to be really difficult to build. It's like, well, that's what's going to make it worth it. Right. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
you came to me to learn what I do. Like, if you want to learn what I do, you gotta do it the hard way sometimes.
I'll end with this one because I am a little bit of a German car nut. Anybody who's closed the door on a German car understands exactly what I'm talking about right now and the quality of a German car door closing. That is one of the most difficult things as a car designer. I'm not a car designer, but I know people who are. That's one of the most difficult and expensive things you can do at the factory is make a door that closes with that amount of precision and clickiness. I don't know how to describe it, but you can feel it when you close that door, and every dollar they put into the tooling and the pieces and parts, the hinges, the latches, the catches, everything that goes into making those doors close that way is hard, but it's worth every bit of effort because when you open the door, your first introduction to the car, when you open the door and you step in and you close it, you're like, I'm in the right car for me. It sold itself. So
Yeah, there's a wonderful pleasure in interacting things that are well designed, not just from a beauty standpoint, but from a function standpoint.
yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely. Well, this has been an awesome topic to talk about. It's one that I'm very passionate about. I think um, when we look at our design work, when we look at our production work, it has to come, it has to be inspiring. It has to come from something that inspired you. And when you put all of that together, you wind up with something where the sum of the parts is greater than the whole, or maybe the other way around. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and I think that's what we're all after, chasing design and making things. And this was awesome to sit and talk about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of our better episodes. But yeah, I think we should end it there. Do you want to start taking us out?
Yeah. So I'm Greg Porter. You can catch me on my YouTube channel, Greg's Garage on YouTube, and Greg's Garage KC on Instagram.
And I'm Brian Benham, and you can find all my socials and YouTube and my website at brianbenham.com. You're listening to the Maker's Quest podcast, where you can find all the show notes and past episodes at themakersquest.com. Thanks for listening.